Stephen Booth, what would you like to see from these negotiations?
Well, I think that there are lots of key areas. I think Matthew touched on some of them in terms of improving competitiveness. A key thing is clearly to improve democratic accountability in the EU, because there's clearly a big democratic deficit in terms of the EU's legitimacy in Britain. And clearly, I think what the key task for Cameron is to tie all these reforms together in wider systemic changes to the EU, in which it's clear that the UK is a member of the single market, it is able to trade freely in Europe, but it's not involved in closer integration that may be needed for the Eurozone. So I think that's a key thing that he needs to secure, and all the other smaller reforms and the detailed reforms need to flow from that premise.
Stephen Booth, do you think that, as I put the point to Matthew earlier before, we need to be part of the EU, certainly businesses do, to succeed and to see growth in this country?
Well, I think the first priority now should be reform. We have a 9 to 12 month period in which we are able to go through this reform process. The UK is able to put its cards on the table. We were able to see the response from other European leaders. And we produced research before the election which illustrated that Brexit itself is not the be-all and end-all. It's what the EU does prior to a Brexit in terms of how reformed it can become. It would also depend on the type of country Britain wanted to be outside the European Union. So there are lots of moving parts here. The key thing now is the Prime Minister has a mandate to secure reform, and I think we should see how that process goes before we jump to knee-jerk conclusions either way.
It's a really complex picture, Stephen Booth, isn't it? It's really not clear what impact a Brexit, Britain exiting from the EU, would have on businesses, because we've had the boss of the CBI say this week businesses need to stick up and stand up for staying in the EU, and the boss of M&S said, actually, let's just wait and see what happens. So there's a real fear factor going on here, isn't there? And actually, it's like Greece exiting from the euro. No one actually knows what could happen.
Well, clearly we need to listen to the views of businesses on either side of the debate. But I think some people are guilty of jumping the gun a little bit, and we have to really sort of all fall in behind the reform effort, because I think no matter where you stand in the debate, if you're in favour of staying in the EU, reform is key, because it's clear that amongst the electorate there's about 20% who are kind of hardcore either in or out, but most people are swing voters and they will wait to see what is on offer when we enter the referendum campaign proper. So it's essential that everyone swings behind reform before we get to that stage. And conversely, if you're on the outside, there is still a chance that the UK will vote to stay in the EU, and clearly the best solution there is as much reform as possible. So it's in everyone's interest to see a reformed offer, and then that will be put to the people, and ultimately the electorate will decide.
Dr. Nichols, I think you're broadly in agreement there, but what, in your view, do you think is actually achievable from the negotiations which are going to take place over the next year or so? Oh, sorry, put that to Matthew Elliott.
I think a lot can be achieved because there is a mandate there, but I think we should always bear in mind that if the EU doesn't reform, if it chooses not to become more competitive, not to step up to having more trade deals and what have you, we shouldn't be afraid of leaving the EU. I think the boss of JCB, Anthony Bamford, was right to say this week that if the EU doesn't reform, we shouldn't be afraid of leaving.
Yeah, we heard from Martin Schulz a short time ago, the president of the EU, said actually they are keen to make the EU more competitive. You know, they seem up for change when we hear the mood music coming from Europe. But how quick is that going to be? Because he actually said we don't want things to happen in 12 months, 18 months. We actually want things to happen now. So do you feel that David Cameron is actually starting something that other countries are going to be keen to get on the bandwagon of, Stephen Booth?
Yes, I think it's clear that there is a greater appetite for reform. We had the European Parliament elections, which were a clear signal from not just the UK electorate, but other electorates around Europe that people think the EU needs to change. So I think there's a much wider agenda about transparency, greater efficiency, better regulation for business. But I think the UK and other non-Eurozone countries also need to seek wider systemic changes to the European Union, which do acknowledge that the Eurozone and the countries outside the Eurozone may be on different paths, and that may require different levels of integration depending on whether you're in the Eurozone or whether you're outside it. I think that is a more ambitious agenda, which I think will be a greater challenge to deliver, but ultimately is probably the bigger prize for the UK.